butterfly in the sky. I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, it's reading a rainbow. I can go anywhere. It's friends to know, ways to grow, it's reading rainbow. I can be anything. Take a look, it's in a book, it's reading rainbow. Reading rainbow, reading rainbow, reading rainbow.
Let us begin. This is the end of Book 3, Chapter 3. When we left our friend Winston, he was being tortured by none other than O'Brien inside of room 101, and he was being tortured via electrocution. And O'Brien kept doing that whole fingers thing with him, like how many fingers am I holding up, that whole thing. And finally, Winston concedes and says, I honestly don't know how many fingers you're holding up. And so then O'Brien says, better, and a needle slides into Winston's arm. Almost in the same instant, a blissful, healing warmth spread all through his body. The pain was already half forgotten. He opened his eyes and looked up gratefully at O'Brien. At sight of heavy, lined face, so ugly and so intelligent, his heart seemed to turn over. If he could have moved, he would have stretched out a hand and laid it on O'Brien's arm. He'd never loved him so deeply as at this moment, and not merely because he had stopped the pain. The old feeling that at bottom it did not matter whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy had come back. O'Brien was a person who could be talked to, perhaps one who did not want to be loved so much as to be understood. O'Brien had tortured him to the edge of lunacy, and in a little while it was certain he would send him to his death. It made no difference. In some sense, that went deeper than friendship. They were intimates. Somewhere or other, although the actual words might have never been spoken, there was a place where they could meet and talk. O'Brien was looking down at him with an expression which suggested that the same thought might be in his own mind, and when he spoke, it was an easy conversational tone. So, Winston has been completely tortured by O'Brien, and yet he still loves and admires him. He still looks to him for safety and security. And at this point, he says, it doesn't matter if he's my friend or foe. He's an equal. He's someone I can talk to. Do you know where you are, Winston? He said. I don't know. I can guess. In the Ministry of Love? Do you know how long you've been here? I don't know. Days, weeks, months? I think it's months. And why do you imagine that we bring people to this place? To make them confess. No, that is not the reason. Try again. To punish them. No! Exclaimed O'Brien. His voice had changed extraordinarily, and his face had suddenly become both stern and animated. No! Not merely to extract your confession, nor to punish you. Shall I tell you why we have brought you here? To cure you! To make you sane! Will you understand, Winston, that no one whom we bring to this place ever leaves our hands uncured? We're not interested in those stupid crimes that you've committed. The party is not interested in the overt act. The thought is all we care about. We do not merely destroy our enemies, we change them. Do you understand what I mean by that? He was bending over Winston. His face looked enormous because of its nearness, and hideously ugly because it was seen from below. Moreover, it was filled with a sort of exultation, a lunatic intensity. Again, Winston's heart sank. If it had been possible, he would have cowered deeper into the bed. He felt certain that O'Brien was about to twist the dial out of sheer wantonness, and at that moment, however, O'Brien turned away. He took a pace or two up or down, and then he continued, less vehemently. So we just learned what does O'Brien say the reason is to bring people to the Ministry of Love and Room 101? It's to cure them. It's to change them as a person. And then we'll find out why here. The first thing for you to understand is that in this place there are no matronomes, which are they're like martyrs. So in history, or even now, I guess, when people do things that are kind of against the grain, and then they're killed or they're put on public display as like something bad, they become martyrs of that cause. So I'm sure you can think of a million examples of people who have been martyrs. So martyrdoms is what he's talking about, that there are none of those. You have read of the religious persecutions of the past. In the Middle Ages, there was an Inquisition. It was a failure. It set out to eradicate heresy and ended by perpetuating it. For every heretic it burned at the stake, thousands of others rose up. Why was that? because the Inquisition killed its enemies in the open and killed them while they were still unrepentant. In fact, it killed them because they were unrepentant. Men were dying because they would not abandon their true beliefs. Naturally, all the glory belonged to the victim and all the shame to the inquisitor who burned him. Later, in the 20th century, there were totalitarians, as they were called. They were the German Nazis and the Russian communists. The Russians persecuted heresy more cruelly than the Inquisition had done, and they imagined that they had learned from the mistakes of the past. They knew, at any rate, that one must not make martyrs. Before they exposed their victims to public trial, they deliberately set themselves to destroy their dignity. They wore them down by torture and solitude until they were despicable, cringing wretches, confessing whatever was put into their mouths, covering themselves with abuse, accusing and sheltering behind one another, whimpering for mercy, and yet after only a few years the same thing had happened over again. The dead men had become martyrs, and their degradation was forgotten. Once again, why was it? In the first place, because the confessions they had made were obviously extorted and untrue. We do not make mistakes of that kind. All the confessions that are uttered here are true. We make them true. And above all, we do not allow the dead to rise up against us. You must stop imagining that posterity will vindicate you, Winston. Posterity will never hear of you. You will be lifted clean out of the stream of history. We shall turn you into gas and pour you into the stratosphere. Nothing will remain of you, not a name in a register, not a memory in a living brain. You will be annihilated in the past as well as in the future. You will have never existed. So Winston has pretty much always wondered why the government does what it does, and O'Brien's starting to give him the answer to that. But also, O'Brien says that this government, this party, this Big Brother party, is stopping the dead from rising, and able to overthrow them. So how does O'Brien say that they're doing it? He basically says they're doing it by changing the person, not only making them confess to things that they didn't do and torturing them and beating them, but they're actually brainwashing them into believing that about themselves, so that when they die, there's no history of them, no one will admit that they ever existed, and when that person dies, they can never become a martyr because they truly believed that what they did was wrong in the end. Which is just, it's crazy, it's mind-blowing. Then why bother to torture me, thought Winston with a momentary bitterness. O'Brien checked his step as though Winston had uttered the thought aloud. His large, ugly face came nearer with the eyes a little narrowed. You're thinking, he said, that since we intend to destroy you utterly, so that nothing you say or do can make the smallest difference, in that case, why do we go through the trouble of interrogating you first? That is what you're thinking, was it not? Yes, said Winston. O'Brien smiled slightly. You were a flaw in the pattern, Winston. You are a stain that must be wiped out. Did I not tell you just now that we are different from the prosecutors of the past? We're not content with negative obedience, nor even with the most abject submission. When finally you surrender to us, it must be of your own free will. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. We convert him. We capture his inner mind and we reshape him. We burn all evil and all illusion out of him. We bring him over to our side, not in appearance, but genuinely, heart and soul. We make him one of ourselves before we kill him. It is intolerable to us that an erroneous thought should exist anywhere in the world, however secret and powerless it might be. Even in the instant of death, we cannot permit any deviation. In the old days, the heretic walked to the stake still a heretic, proclaiming his heresy, exulting in it. When the victim of the Russian purges could carry rebellion locked up in a skull as he walked down the passage waiting for the bullet. But we make the brain perfect before we blow it out. The command of the old despotisms was, thou shalt not. The command of the totalitarians was, thou shalt. Our command is, thou art. No one who we bring to this place ever stands out against us. Everyone is washed clean, even those 3 miserable traitors in whose innocence you once believed, Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. In the end, we broke them down. I took part in their interrogation myself. I saw them gradually worn down, whimpering, groveling, weeping, and in the end it was not with a pair of fear, only with patience. Not with a pain of fear, only with penitence. By the time we had finished with them, they were only the shells of men. There was nothing left in them except sorrow for what they had done, and the love of Big Brother. It was touching to see how they loved him. They begged to be shot quickly, so that they could die while their minds were still clean. I mean, this is just straight diabolical. So they capture these people, these renegades, like Winston's. They capture these people, anyone who goes against the government. The Parsons, I keep forgetting his name, that one guy that he was kind of friends with, not Smee, that one guy that he was friends with. So they all got captured and taken to Room 101, and this whole thing happened to them. They were brutally tortured and broken down until all they had left of them was a shell of themselves and this utter belief and love of Big Brother, and then they get killed. It's diabolical. His voice had grown almost dreamy. The exultation, the lunatic enthusiasm was still in his face. He's not pretending, thought Winston. He's not a hypocrite. He believes every word he says. What most depressed him was the consciousness of his own intellectual inferiority. He watched the heavy, yet graceful form strolling to and fro, in and out of the range of his vision. O'Brien was a being in all ways larger than himself. There was no idea what he ever had, or could have, that O'Brien had not long ago known, examined, and rejected. His mind contained Winston's mind, but in that case, how could it be true that O'Brien was mad? It must be he, Winston, who was mad. O'Brien halted and looked down at him. His voice had grown stern again. So, to go back to some of the questions, 5 says, O'Brien says that Winston is a stain that must be wiped out. What do you think that means? I think it kind of means that he's a stain in society, like he's the one standing out. He's the thing that doesn't belong. And so he needs to be wiped out, like he needs to be made clean, basically, in mind and in action. And then, because of O'Brien's revelations about why the government's ways, which Winston literally has been struggling the entire novel to know why the government does what it does, O'Brien tells him why the government does what it does. It wants to change people before they go to death, because that way they can never come back and become martyrs. Just like in history, if you think of Nazism and the Jews and stuff, and like now, Jewish religion and heritage has been like martyred because of what happened to them in the past, rightfully so. But I mean, nowadays, there's a lot more to that than there was previous to that, because there was martyrs that were left behind. The ones who survived could tell the story, and then others would, feel bad and feel like they needed to do something about it, which changed things. And this will never happen in this society because the government literally changes the people before they die. So then, let's go back. His voice had grown stern again. Do not imagine that you will save yourself, Winston, however completely you surrender to us. No one who has once gone astray is ever spared, and even if we chose to let you live out of natural term of your life, still you would never escape us. What happens to you here is forever. Understand that in advance. We shall crush you down to the point from which there is no coming back. Things will happen to you from which you could not recover. If you lived 1,000 years, never again will you be capable of ordinary human feeling. Everything will be dead inside you. Never again will you be capable of love or friendship or joy of living or laughter or curiosity or courage or integrity. You will be hollow. We shall squeeze you empty, and then we will fill you with ourselves. Kind of a gross thought, but so basically, the thing that Winston says, that the only way they're going to remain alive, he and Julia, is if they hold on to their humanity, right? Hold on to their ability to be a human and love each other and have that, the dreamy feeling of being in Charrington's room upstairs and watching, the curtain on the window like slowly, wave in the breeze of the summer cool air and have this moment together. Like, those things are what make a human. And O'Brien is saying, when you leave here, you will have none of that, which is the ultimate betrayal, isn't it? Didn't Winston say that would be the ultimate betrayal, is if he gave up those feelings and gave up that ability in himself? And O'Brien's saying, trust me, that's going to be gone. He paused and signed to the man in the white coat. Winston was aware of some heavy piece of apparatus being pushed into place behind his head. O'Brien had sat down beside the bed so that his face was almost on level with Winston's. 3,000, he said, speaking over Winston's head to the man in the white coat. 2 soft pads, which felt slightly moist, clamped themselves against Winston's temples. He quailed. There was pain coming. A new kind of pain. O'Brien laid a hand reassuringly, almost kindly on his. This time, it will not hurt, he said. Keep your eyes fixed on mine. Oh boy, here it comes. At this moment, there was a devastating explosion, or what seemed like an explosion, though it was not certain whether there was any noise. There was undoubtedly a blinding flash of light, and Winston was not hurt, only prostrated. Although he had already been lying on his back when the thing happened, he had a curious feeling that he had been knocked into that position. A terrific, painless blow had flattened him out. Also, something had happened inside his head. As his eyes regained their focus, he remembered who he was and where he was, and recognized the face that was gazing into his own. But somewhere or other there was a large patch of emptiness, as though a piece had been taken out of his brain. "It will not last," said O'Brien. "Look me in the eyes. What country is Oceania at war with?" Winston thought. He knew what was meant by Oceania, and that he himself was a citizen of Oceania. He also remembered Eurasia and Eastasia, but who was at war with whom he did not know. In fact, he had not been aware that there was any war. "I don't remember." "Oceania is at war with Eastasia. Do you remember now?" "Yes." "Oceania has always been at war with Eastasia, since the beginning of your life, since the beginning of the party, since the beginning of history. The war has continued without a break, always the same war. Do you remember that?" "Yes." 11 years ago, you created a legend about 3 men who had been condemned to death for treachery. You pretended that you'd seen a piece of paper which proved them innocent. No such piece of paper ever existed. You invented it, and later you grew to believe in it. You remember now the very moment at which you first invented it. Do you remember that?" "Yes." "Just now, I held up the fingers of my hand to you, and you saw 5 fingers. Do you remember that?" "Yes." O'Brien held up the fingers of his left hand, with the thumb concealed. "There are 5 fingers there. Do you see 5 fingers?" "Yes." And he did see them. For a fleeting instant, before the scenery of his mind changed, he saw 5 fingers, and there was no deformity. Then everything was normal again, and the old fear, the hatred, and the bewilderment came crowding back in. But there had been a moment, he did not know how long, 30 seconds perhaps, of luminous certainty, when each new suggestion of O'Brien's had filled up a patch of emptiness and became absolute truth, and when 2 and 2 could have been 3 as easily as 5, if that were what was needed. It had faded out before O'Brien had dropped his hand, but though he could not recapture it, he could remember it, as one remembers a vivid experience at some remote period of one's life when one was in effect with a different person. "You see now," said O'Brien, "that it is at any rate possible." "Yes," said Winston. O'Brien stood up with a satisfied air. Over his left, Winston saw the man in the white coat break an ampule and draw back the plunger of the syringe. O'Brien turned to Winston with a smile. In almost the old manner, he resettled his spectacles on his nose. Man. So after the revelation of why the government is doing what it's doing, the question is asking you, he gets this big last blow to the brain, and basically what just happened to Winston? So Winston literally just got shocked to a point of almost oblivion. He can't remember huge chunks of his life anymore. He can't remember huge chunks of anything. Facts, history, knowledge he's had. He can't remember any of that stuff. And what does O'Brien do? Just fills in the gaps with what he wants him to think, what he wants him to know. "Do you remember writing in your diary," he said, "that it did not matter whether I was a friend or an enemy, since I was at least a person who understood you and could be talked to? You were right. I enjoy talking to you. Your mind appeals to me. It resembles my own, except that you happen to be insane. Before we bring the session to an end, you can ask me a few questions if you choose." "Any questions I like?" "Anything." He saw that Winston's eyes were upon the dial. Switched off. "What's your first question?" "What have you done with Julia?" said Winston. O'Brien smiled again. "She betrayed you, Winston. Immediately. Unreservedly. I have seldom seen anyone come over to us so promptly. You would hardly recognize her if you saw her. All her rebelliousness, her deceit, her folly, her dirty-mindedness, everything has been burned out of her. It was a perfect conversation, a textbook case." "You tortured her." O'Brien left this unanswered. "Next question," he said. "Does Big Brother exist?" "Of course he exists. The party exists. Big Brother is the embodiment of the party." "Does he exist in the same way I exist?" "You do not exist," said O'Brien. So what is the first question after being saved by O'Brien? It's about Julia, right? As soon as Winston regains himself, he wants to know what happened to Julia. So what do you think that says about Winston? Maybe he's still holding on to some of himself? Maybe he's still able to have some feelings towards her? I mean, it's an interesting thought. Maybe there's still a little bit left of him. And then he asks, does Big Brother exist? And O'Brien's like, duh, obviously it does. And he's like, okay, but does it exist like I do? And I love it. O'Brien's just like, you do not exist, because he's not. He doesn't, right? Like he's going to get wiped out just like everyone else. Once again, the sense of helplessness assailed him. He knew, or he could imagine, the arguments which proved his non-existence, but they were nonsense. They were only a play on words. Did not the statement, you do not exist, contain a logical absurdity? I mean, if we pause for a moment and think about that, it totally does, right? If someone says you do not exist, well, who are they talking to if that person doesn't exist, or if that thing doesn't exist? But what use was it to say so? His mind shriveled as he thought of the unanswerable, mad arguments with which O'Brien would demolish him. I think I exist, he said warily. I'm conscious of my own identity. I was born and I shall die. I have arms and legs. I occupy a particular point in space. No other solid object can occupy the same point simultaneously. In that sense, does Big Brother exist? So Winston is a really deep thinker, and he's saying, like, I know I exist because I am taking up space in the world right now that nothing else can take that space of. If I'm sitting here on this bench, nothing else can be sitting on this bench in the same way I am, because I'm taking up this space. So how is it that I don't exist, is basically how Winston's arguing it. And so he wants to know, does Big Brother exist like that? Is it a physical, tangible person or a group of people? It is of no importance. He exists. Will Big Brother ever die? Of course not. How could he die? Next question. Does the Brotherhood exist? That, Winston, you will never know. If we choose to set you free when we have finished with you, and if you live to be 90 years old, still you will never learn whether the answer to that question is yes or no. As long as you live, it will be unsolved riddle in your mind. Oof. Ouch. So he's like, if we let you live, you're going to be so far changed and so much more of a party leader that you should have been that you'll never know the answer to that, because you'll never seek out the answer. Winston lay silent. His breast rose and fell a little faster. He still had not asked the question that had come into his mind first. He had got to ask it, and yet it was as though his tongue would not utter it. There was a trace of amusement in O'Brien's face. Even his spectacles seemed to wear an ironical gleam. He knows, thought Winston suddenly. He knows that I'm going to ask. At the thought, the words burst out of him. What is room 101? The expression on O'Brien's face did not change. He answered dryly. You know what room 101 is, Winston. Everyone knows what is in room 101. He raised a finger to the man in the white coat. Evidently, the session was at end. A needle jerked into Winston's arm, and he sank almost instantly into a deep sleep. And that concludes Book 3, Chapter 2. Until next time.